He thought she'd always be there. No matter how many times he pulled away, no matter how many times he made her feel like an afterthought, she stayed. She loved him in a way that was rare, without hesitation, without conditions. And for the longest time, he believed that love was endless. That no matter how many times he walked away, she would still be waiting when he decided to come back. But love doesn't work like that. The night he left for the last time, she didn't beg him to stay. She didn't chase after him, didn't ask for an explanation. She just stood there, silent, watching as he walked out of her life. Maybe he expected tears. Maybe he thought she'd fight for him one more time. But she didn't. Something in her eyes had changed, and yet he didn't notice. At first, he didn't think much of it. He told himself he needed space, that it was better this way. He had other priorities, other dreams to chase. He convinced himself she'd be fine, she always was. And if he ever missed her, if he ever wanted to see her again, all he had to do was show up. But time has a way of shifting things. Months passed. The calls stopped. The messages went unanswered. The life he thought he could return to one day, it was gone, and she was nowhere to be found. Then he started hearing things. Whispers of her name in conversations, mentions of her in places he never expected. He saw her in headlines, on screens, in places he never imagined she'd be. She was rising fast. She had rebuilt herself, but this time without him. The girl who once dropped everything for him, who used to dim her own light just to make space for his, was now untouchable. And that's when it hit him. He hadn't just lost her. He had lost the best thing that had ever happened to him. And now, she was too far ahead to even look back. That night, as he scrolled through his phone, he saw her name again. It wasn't just a passing mention anymore, it was everywhere. A feature in a major magazine, a new business launch, an event where she stood beside people he once thought were untouchable. She had stepped into a world he never thought she belonged to, but now it was as if she had been made for it all along. He told himself it was just curiosity. That was the only reason he kept searching for more. But with every article, every photo, every post, the truth became harder to ignore. She wasn't just moving on, she was thriving. And worse, it was as if he had never existed. He thought back to the beginning, to the moments that led them here. He had met her at a time when he wasn't ready to love the way she did. She had this way of seeing the best in people, of believing in them even when they gave her every reason not to. And for a long time, he had taken that for granted. He had assumed she'd always be there, waiting, because she always was. He remembered the nights when she'd sit across from him, asking him where he saw their future, and how he had always avoided the question. He had convinced himself that there was always time, that he could figure things out later. She was patient, but patience has limits now. He wondered when it had changed for her. When had she decided she was done waiting? Was it the last time he walked away without looking back? Or had she known long before that he wasn't sure when he made the decision to see her again? Maybe it was the loneliness creeping in, or maybe it was the realization that nothing else in his life had ever felt as real as she did. But he needed to know. He needed to see her, to talk to her. Maybe even fix things. The first time he reached out, she didn't answer. The second time, it was the same. But the third time, he got a response not from her, but from someone on her team. A short, professional message, polite but distant. It was clear. She wasn't available. That should have been enough for him to let go. But it wasn't so. He showed up. The event was high profile. Something he would have never imagined her being a part of before. He stood at the entrance, watching as she walked in, surrounded by people who looked at her with admiration, respect. She was different now, not in a way that made her unrecognizable, but in a way that made him realize she had always been meant for more. For a brief moment, their eyes met. And in that second, he expected something, a flicker of recognition, a sign that she still saw him the way she used to, But there was nothing she looked at him the way she looked at anyone else in the room. Polite, composed, but detached. And then, just like that, she turned away. As if he had never been there at all, he stood frozen in place, watching as she disappeared into the crowd, surrounded by people who now belonged in her world. The moment felt surreal, like something out of a dream or maybe a nightmare. He had told himself that if he could just see her, just talk to her, he could find a way back in. But now, he wasn't even sure if she'd let him. As the night went on, he stayed on the edges of the event, observing her from a distance. She moved with confidence, a quiet power in the way she spoke and carried herself. He recognized pieces of the woman he once knew, but there was something else now, something unshakable, untouchable. He overheard snippets of conversations about her. People spoke about her success, her resilience, the way she had built herself up from nothing. They admired her, respected her. Some envied her, but no one spoke about the past. No one mentioned the night she had cried over someone who had taken her love for granted. No one knew about the version of her that used to wait for someone who never chose her. He was beginning to realize that version of her no longer existed. Still, he couldn't leave. He needed to try, even if it was just once. When he finally worked up the courage to approach her, she was mid-conversation with someone important. He waited on the sidelines, hoping she'd see him, but she didn't. Not until he stepped forward, clearing his throat, forcing her to acknowledge his presence. She turned, her expression unreadable. "I wasn't expecting to see you here." Her voice was calm, almost too controlled. "I wanted to talk," he said, searching her face for something familiar, something warm. Her lips pressed together for a moment before she exhaled. "Now's not the time." It wasn't a rejection, it was a dismissal. And for the first time, he realized what it felt like to be on the other side. To be the one waiting, the one hoping. But he wasn't ready to walk away. Not yet. He hesitated, feeling the weight of everything he had left unsaid. "I didn't think things would end like this." Her expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. A memory, maybe. A shadow of something long buried. But instead of answering, she turned to someone nearby. "Excuse me," she said, already moving on, already leaving him behind. And just like that, he was invisible again. That night, as he walked away from the event, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: regret. Real, suffocating regret. He had spent so long believing she would always be there, always waiting. But she wasn't waiting anymore. And the worst part? He wasn't sure if he had lost her forever, or if she had simply outgrown him. Days passed, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he had made a mistake, one that he couldn't undo. He had let too much time slip away, believing he had all the time in the world. But now, standing on the outside of her life, he realized time had moved forward without him. She had moved forward, and he was stuck in the past, chasing something that might not even exist anymore. He tried reaching out, sending a message that went unanswered. Then, another. Finally, he dialed her number, his heartbeat quickening as the phone rang. When her voice answered, it wasn't live, it was her voicemail. He hesitated before speaking, unsure of what to say, then finally muttered, "I just want to talk." He hung up, feeling foolish. The next day, he ran into someone who had been at the event. They talked about how much she had changed, how different she was now. "She's untouchable," they said. "She's got everything she ever wanted." The words stung. He had once been everything she wanted. Now, she didn't even need him. He couldn't accept that. Not yet determined, he found himself outside the glass doors of her office building, staring up at the place she had built from the ground up. He had once thought she'd never make it. Now, she was the one making all the decisions. He walked in, expecting security to stop him, but no one did. Maybe they assumed he belonged there. Maybe they assumed he had an appointment. He rode the elevator up, each floor bringing a rush of emotions. regret, hope, fear. When the doors opened, he stepped into a space filled with energy, people moving, talking, working. He spotted her in a meeting room, deep in conversation with someone important. She looked different in this space, more powerful, more certain of herself. He had never seen her like this before. She turned, locking eyes with him through the glass wall. For a moment, everything stilled. Then, without hesitation, she turned back to her meeting. Ignoring him completely, he stood there, feeling the weight of her silence. She wasn't going to make this easy for him, and maybe she wasn't going to give him another chance at all. He stood frozen outside the glass-walled conference room, watching as she continued her meeting without a second glance in his direction. It was as if he were invisible, like he no longer had any significance in her world. A lump formed in his throat, but he refused to walk away just yet. Not without trying. He turned to a nearby assistant and asked, "When will she be free?" The assistant barely spared him a glance before saying, "She has a full schedule today." Something inside him twisted. He had been part of her life long enough to know that if she wanted to see him, she would. She was choosing to keep him waiting, not out of busyness, but because she had nothing to say to him. Still, he waited. Minutes turned into an hour. The meeting ended, and she walked out, her focus on a document in her hand. For a moment, he thought she might walk right past him, but then she stopped, looking up at him with unreadable eyes. "I didn't expect to see you here," she said finally, her voice cool, professional. He tried to read between the lines, searching for something, anything that suggested she still cared. "I needed to see you," he admitted. "To talk." Her lips pressed together. "I'm not sure what there is to talk about." "You know what?" he said, lowering his voice. "Us." A shadow crossed her expression, but she masked it quickly. "There is no users anymore." She turned, walking toward her office. He followed, without thinking. "Wait," he said, stepping in behind her before the door could close. She exhaled sharply, setting her papers down. "You can't just show up like this." "I didn't know how else to reach you," he admitted. "You don't answer my messages." "Because there's nothing left to say." He hesitated. "Is that really how you feel?" Her gaze flickered for just a second, but then she squared her shoulders. Yes. For the first time, it hit him. She wasn't just angry. She wasn't playing hard to get. She had truly moved on. And maybe, just maybe, he was too late. But before he could process that, there was a knock at the door. It swung open, and a man stepped inside. Confident, at ease. And the way she looked at him, familiar, trusting, made something in his chest tighten. "I hope I'm not interrupting," the man said, glancing between them. She smiled, the warmth in it something he hadn't seen in a long time. "Not at all. I was just finishing up here." And just like that, he knew. She hadn't just moved on emotionally. There was someone else now. Someone who stood where he used to. And for the first time, he realized he might have lost her for good. He felt the weight of reality pressing down on him as he watched her exchange a glance with the man beside her. It was subtle, almost unnoticeable, but it was enough. Enough to confirm what he had been afraid to admit. She had moved on, not just in her career, but in her life. And he was no longer a part of it. She turned back to him, her expression unreadable. "I really do have to get back to work." He knew this was his last chance. If he walked away now, there might never be another moment like this. His voice was quiet but firm when he finally spoke. "I made a mistake." A flicker of emotion crossed her face, but she didn't let it linger. "I know." He took a step closer, lowering his voice. "I thought I had time. I thought you'd always be there." Her jaw tightened. "I was. Until I wasn't." The words hit him harder than he expected. He had always imagined that if he ever decided to come back, there would be a way to fix things. But now, standing in front of her, he could see it in her eyes. She wasn't waiting for him anymore. The other man shifted, sensing the tension. Maybe this isn't the time for. It's fine, she interrupted, her voice steady. We're just finishing up. He swallowed hard. Just tell me one thing. Was I ever enough for you? She exhaled, something soft and almost sad in her expression. You were never the problem. For a second, hope flickered in his chest. But then she continued. I just outgrew waiting for you. It was the answer he hadn't expected, but somehow knew deep down. He had spent so much time thinking she'd be there when he was ready, but she had been growing, evolving, becoming someone he could no longer reach. He nodded slowly, forcing himself to accept it. I guess I deserve that. She didn't confirm or deny it. Instead, she just looked at him, her gaze filled with something that wasn't quite regret, but wasn't cruelty either. You'll be okay, she said finally. You always are. He opened his mouth, but there was nothing left to say. The conversation was over. The chapter was closed, and for the first time, he understood she wasn't just untouchable now. She had been for a long time. He had just been too blind to see it. He stood there for a moment longer, watching her walk away, the weight of everything settling in his chest. He had always believed that time would work in his favor, that no matter how much distance grew between them, there would always be a way back. But now he understood some things, once lost, could never truly be recovered. She disappeared through the office doors, her presence lingering in the air like an echo of something that used to be his. The realization hit him in waves. He had been so sure that if he showed up, if he apologized, if he said the right words, she would look at him the way she used to. But the past had slipped through his fingers, and she had found a future without him. With a deep breath, he turned and walked away, his mind racing with memories of what they had been, what they could have been, and the painful truth of what they would never be again. The world outside the building felt different, sharper somehow, as if everything around him had shifted while he was standing still. The city buzzed with life, people moving in every direction, caught up in their own stories. For the first time in a long time, he felt like an outsider looking in. He had spent so much time convincing himself that he had made the right choice all those years ago, that walking away was necessary. But now, faced with the reality of her absence, he wasn't sure what he had been holding onto anymore. His phone buzzed in his pocket, snapping him out of his thoughts. He pulled it out, staring at the name on the screen. It was a familiar number, one he had ignored too many times before. This time, he answered. Yeah, he said, his voice rougher than he intended. You finally picked up, the voice on the other end said, half amused, half relieved. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. Yeah. You okay? He hesitated before answering. Was he? I don't know, he admitted. There was a pause. You want to talk about it? For years, he had kept everything locked inside, convinced that dealing with things alone made him stronger. But standing there with everything he had been running from finally catching up to him, he realized how exhausted he was. Yeah, he said finally. I think I do. The conversation stretched into the evening, his feet carrying him aimlessly through the streets as he talked, letting out thoughts he hadn't voiced in years. And as the words spilled out, something inside him shifted. It wasn't closure, not exactly, but it was something close. Days passed, then weeks. He focused on work, on himself, on figuring out what came next. He still thought about her, of course. There were moments when he'd see something that reminded him of her, and the ache in his chest would return. But with time, the pain became less sharp, less consuming. One afternoon, he found himself in a cafe he hadn't visited in years. It had been their place once, a small corner shop, tucked away from the noise of the city. He wasn't sure why he had walked in, maybe out of habit, maybe out of curiosity. He ordered his usual and sat by the window, watching people pass by. That's when he saw her. She was across the street, laughing at something the man beside her had said. She looked happy. Different, yet still the same. and for the first time, he didn't feel the need to chase after her. He took a sip of his coffee, letting the warmth settle inside him. Maybe he had lost her, but he hadn't lost everything. There was still more to his story, more chapters to be written, and this time he wouldn't waste them.